Hello and welcome to this special webinar to reflect and to remember the 1992 Los Angeles riots, or the 1992 LA uprising, the conflict and the tensions and the turmoil that took place in LA after Rodney King was brutalized. That brutalization of a black man by 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers was recorded by someone who took out a camera and recorded through their window and then shared it with the world. This created massive unrest throughout the entire city for between April and May of 1992, emerging in South Central LA, where they believed that justice would finally be served on an issue that many people within the African American community had been concerned about and addressing and advocating for and against for decades on end. After the jury acquitted the 4 officers who were charged with using excessive force in the arrest of Rodney King, it sparked major unrest and led to what we now know as the 1992 Los Angeles riots. What's significant about this is that this event is one that both highlighted and revealed the persistent challenges, struggles, frustrations, injustices that the African American community had faced for decades, but were never really believed, as well as revealing long-standing, deeply rooted interminority tensions that had festered over time, beginning in the Family Red Apple boycotts in New York, then moving towards the killing and murder of Latasha Harlins by Sun Jadu, and then of course the riots after Rodney King was brutalized and the officers not held accountable. This is also probably one of the most complex circumstances that people have not, at a popular level, really did not really dive into, and so there are a lot of partial stories or partial understandings that lead people to believe that this is a Black and Asian conflict or a Black and Korean conflict, neglecting the broader and wider realities of racism and white supremacy that essentially led Commander Gates of the LAPD at the time to essentially say, let it burn, but the parts of the city that were allowed to let burn were literally the parts of the city with the minorities in it, and one of the things that people often forget is that the police essentially blocked off all of the white neighborhoods and let all the communities of color to fend for themselves and to essentially do whatever they wanted. They abandoned their call to serve and protect in a time of great need, and all of the communities felt that. And so I'm really excited to have the conversation that we are about to have with our esteemed guests. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they appear on my screen. The first is Reverend Hyepin Im, who is the president and the founder of Faith and Community Empowerment in Los Angeles. She empowers churches and nonprofits to leverage their resources by building capacity, leadership and partnership in economic development, and serving as a bridge between the Asian American community and the greater community at large. And she does a lot of wonderful work, especially advocating for Koreans and Korean Americans, but then of course does more when it comes to more community development work and trying to build bridges across dividing lines. And I'll have all of our panelists share a little bit more. The second speaker we have is Leon Harris, Dr. Leon Harris, who is SoCal native from South Central LA. He is a faculty member at Biola University in systematic theology, and is a deeply thoughtful, engaged Christian leader who is constantly reflecting on life and theologizing as he thinks. Then we have Dr. Alexander Jun, who is a professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific University, who does his research on equity and justice in higher education around the world. And he is also in the PCA as one of its former moderators, and someone who does a lot of scholarship on issues of race. Last but not least, certainly not least, is Reverend Dr. Mark E Whitlock Jr., who is a longstanding member of the AME Church. He's currently in Maryland, serving at Reed Temple AME. But before he was at the historic Reed Temple AME, he was serving as the pastor of Christ Our Redeemer AME Church in Irvine, as well as First AME Church in Los Angeles. And so all of these esteemed folk are people who know, who were there in Los Angeles when the riots broke out. I've asked them to share from their perspective and asked them to infuse their faith into all things. And as they do, my hope is that it will help us deepen our understanding of something that is oftentimes superficially spoken about, not understood fully, especially as we excavate what occurred in 1992, to understand that it was a function of a deeper racism that has never been fully addressed. And so I'm going to introduce them now, and I'm excited for this conversation we're about to have. Welcome, everyone, to this special panel and webinar to discuss the LA riots, which took place in 1992. I think it's an important event that took place in our history throughout the United States, which really captured the imagination and highlighted the ways that marginalization, under-resourcing, and neglect can really incite some major tensions, conflicts, and an uprising to some degree on when it comes to racial issues and racialized communities. I'm really excited to be joined by some very esteemed panelists who were all in LA at the time, leading and serving and participating in communal life in the Los Angeles area during 1992, during this time on April 29th. And there's a lot to uncover, because I don't think that we often hear the perspectives that emerge from the church, from those who follow Jesus and are seeking his kingdom here in this world. And so I'm not going to speak much into it, because I want their stories and their perspectives and what they saw and what they heard to really emerge. But just as a quick overview of what happened in 1992, and they will flesh this out a little more in our time together. There was a recording that took place of a police brutality against Rodney King, who was an African-American man. And the African-American community had been expressing concerns and frustrations about police mistreatment for years and decades, which follow historical patterns of state-sanctioned violence. That had led to someone pulling out their video camera when they saw Rodney King being beaten, and by several police officers, and then 4 of them were placed on under trial. what ended up happening, though, was that all of them were acquitted, and only one of them was convicted of aggravated assault. That means that they all got away pretty much scot-free. This created extreme. This reminded all of the communities, especially within the African American communities, that there really is no there is no peace without justice, and that there is not a adequate addressing of systemic ills against minoritized communities, especially the African American community, and that led to a deep, a profound response that really impacted not only the African American community, but in a significant way the Korean American community. At the same time, in Los Angeles, there were interminority tensions arising between the Korean and African American communities, which I believe as Christians we need to press into due to deep influences of racialization and white supremacy that have essentially pitted our communities together by making our communities believe that we are in opposition to one another instead of brothers and sisters in humanity, and especially and including brothers and sisters in Christ often. And so millions and millions of dollars were lost. The Korean American community really struggled and suffered as a result of what happened in LA, and the grief of the African American community was on full display because of the significant neglect and promises unkept and unmet to them by leaders across the board. And so there's a lot to unpack and there's a lot to share. But I'm really excited to introduce our panelists here. I'm going to have them share a little bit more about their bios, but I'm going to go down the line on what appears on my screen to have them share and to share their names. First, we have Reverend Hyepin Im. She is at FACE in Los Angeles, and she's really been doing some incredible work in leading and having conversations on Black and Asian issues in the Los Angeles area, and has been a part of doing a lot of community development there. Dr. Leon Harris is at Biola University. He's a professor, but he was living in South Central at the time, and has some really rich reflections to share about his experiences. Dr. Mark Whitlock was a pastor in the LA area, and was a significant leader who was pushing for reconciliation and serving the community well. And then, of course, we have Dr. Alex Jun, who is a professor at Azusa Pacific University, who was living in Koreatown at the time. And so I'm going to ask you to go down the list, but as you do, if you want to share a little bit more about kind of where you were, what you saw, but more importantly, what were the LA riots? What do people need to know about it? Why was it so significant? What was the impact, and why are we still talking about it 30 years later? So I want to ask you to share a little bit about yourself, and then tell us about the riots. What do people need to know, especially from your perspective? Hyepin, do you want to go first?
I was actually a USC MBA student, but also doing my internship at Toshiba Irvine. Just a few days before, being single Korean American, Koreatown was kind of the place to play. And so even though Koreatown is not known to be kind of the safest neighborhood, still, it was a place that I didn't really have to worry about. And the riots broke out, and it was surreal to feel that it was a war zone and to feel unsafe to enter into that space. But subsequently to that, I didn't know that there was something called the Black Korean conflict, but the media kept playing this over and over again. And what was frustrating was that, there were no voices in our community, except for maybe Angela O when she went on CNN. But otherwise, the representation and voice of the Korean American community was pretty much dismal. And it was heartbreaking when 65% of all businesses destroyed were Korean American. I believe it probably was the largest incident of anti-Asian violence. And again, I knew that there was more to the story than the way that the Korean community was being depicted. And so, especially for the 10th anniversary, why it matters now, why it matters then, why it's that first for the Korean community, they realized they were abandoned by the police. And I believe that if the police had done their job and the city leadership had done their job, then I don't think the devastation would have been so great. It would have been contained. But I have heard from too many people who have witnessed the police barricade the nicer areas of city like Beverly Hills and others. And so all the violence was contained, and all the Koreans and other community members in Koreatown were all stuck there to fend for ourselves. And so the depiction of Koreans on the rooftop shooting, many of them had fake guns. They were facing gang members coming and shooting at them, and the riot, the looting, and so it was a very dangerous environment in which young people and even older people took up guns. It was kind of like the militia, during when America was forming its country, that people called to service because there was no one else there to respond. But I think for the 10th anniversary, I saw President Bush come into town, and he bypassed Korean community, and there was no mention. He actually went to First AME, and where I eventually worked with Reverend Mark E Whitlock. But there was no mention, as far as I know, an acknowledgement of the suffering of the Korean community. And also, again, 10 years later, there was still no recognizable voices, leadership in the Korean community. So the only voices that were heard were largely from the leadership that were active back during the riots, largely African-American elected officials and community leaders who, again, demonized these store owners. And so I realized that, gosh, you know what? To be victimized during the riots, but then 10 years to be re-victimized was something that I saw as something that needed to be addressed. And particularly, I say the current optics of the Black and Asian violence is real. And as some people have mentioned, even during the George Floyd crisis, when the protests were about to arise, and if you go to some of the social media rooms, the Asians are going, hey, you know what, we need to gun up. Which again is not necessarily the response that, our communities should be addressing our challenges where we've been pitted against one another. And so part of the work that I think is important, first, the color of justice should be the same for all, and it isn't. And second is that the myths that we tell of each other, that really the white supremacy has set up the game, hurts all of us. And we need to break down those myths, expose the truth, open eyes and open hearts. And I hope that this conversation will be one way that we could help address that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hyepin. There's so much I want to follow up with you, but I'm gonna because it's a great kind of bridge to have Dr. Whitlock or Reverend Whitlock jump in. Mark, can you share some perspectives from your end?
Yeah, at the time, I was working as a vice president of Chicago Title. I was in a boardroom closing a business deal with a bunch of white guys. And I think the deal was worth about $45-50 million. I was in real estate, and volunteering my time at First AME Church on a regular basis, having had that year to meet with the mayor, Tom Bradley. We had an opportunity to meet with Jesse Brewer, who was the assistant police chief for the city of Los Angeles, because Chief Daryl Gates refused to meet with us at First AME Church. And then we also met with Bernard Parks, who was a high-ranking individual, but he wasn't in charge. Jesse Brewer was. And we had planned what we're going to do, because we were almost certain that two of those police officers would be found guilty. But four were being charged, two would be found guilty. And so I'm in this boardroom on the day of the verdicts. Now, I already knew that the mayor would call us and tell us to meet at First AME Church, because we had an event planned at the church, because I was an officer of the church, volunteer of the church. And when I'm sitting in this boardroom and all white people doing a deal, the room literally froze when we heard not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And I'm telling you, everybody shifted their eyes directly at me. And I'm going like, why y'all looking at me? And I left the boardroom, never to go back to corporate America, never to go back and work for another major corporation. I went back to First AME Church, and I didn't go home for 3 days. Had a chance to be there to witness the media and all the rest. We do know that 64 people died as a result of the unrest. Of those 64 that died, 28 of them were African American, 19 were Latino, 15 were white, 2 were Asians. No police officer died. Billions of dollars lost, and then 50,000 jobs left South Central Los Angeles, now known as South LA. So for me, it was nihilism, because I had an opportunity to meet Rodney King. Rodney King was not bright. He was not a communicator. He was not articulate at all when we met him. But I'm telling you, he was 6'4", and he was a big guy. And so that whole stereotypical look at how you treat African American men was obvious, and it was true, because Rodney King represented it. And you know, all the things that First AME Church did, but it changed my life. I believe I am here now because of it, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, we're looking to pressing into more of that. Alex, Dr. John, would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you so much for having this conversation. The LA riots, I feel like it was one example of the thing that comes to mind is a volcano. That it was bubbling up, lava was there, and eventually we had an eruption. Or a better example may be in California, because we have lots of earthquakes. It's what's underneath the ground. It's the fault lines that we live on, and eventually something emerges and you have an earthquake. We only look at the surface issues, but we have to look beneath. One example for me is what happened a year before the riots, right? That was recorded, and this is the death of a young woman, Latasha Harlins, a Black woman, young girl, really, 14, 15 years old, and murdered by Sunja Do, Korean American, immigrant, older woman working in a store. Looks just like my aunt, looks like my mom. You know, it's very typical for me. But you know, was it self-defense for her? I mean, in the Korean community, and some of the work I was doing at the time, from 91 to 93, so the riots were right in the middle of this. I was working in Koreatown, working at Korean Youth and Community Center, KYCC, right off of Wilton. And the church that I attended was on First in Vermont. It was a Korean church, Nasong Sumbogum Gyoe, LA Full Gospel Church. So everything for me was right in the center of Koreatown, right in downtown LA. But in the community that I was in the Christian community, for Korean Americans, it was a real struggle. The incident that happened with Latasha Harlins, that was video recorded. We had footage of that. There's footage of lots of things that happened in communities for Korean Americans. Regular, ongoing theft, violence, lots of racial strife that went on in these stores. Liquor stores, convenience stores, whatever you want to call them, but that's even open to debate now, right? What was fascinating to me was the anti-Blackness was already in place for some Korean American communities, in the church and outside the church. Lots of fear, lots of misunderstanding, and anti-Asian sentiment was very present as well in downtown LA. These are not conversations that we were ready to have. Just lots of immigrants. We didn't even mention Latino communities that lived right alongside the Korean communities and the Black communities. And when the looting and all the violence started, you saw a lot of Latino neighbors breaking into stores and whatnot. And so who was missing from this? Hyepin, you made a great point about justice should have no color. It should have no color, but injustice had a color, and it was white. And so I think reframing this and understanding, not pitting one community against the other, what we failed to recognize at the time, for me certainly, was white supremacy and the power of white supremacy laws and policies that were in place, decisions that were made. It was mentioned earlier about the police cordoning off a certain area right outside of Koreatown. And if you go just a little bit west outside of Koreatown, mid-Wilshire, you're starting to look at much nicer communities, right, leading to Beverly Hills, which is all part of LA. So that was part of the challenge, I think. Why was this so significant? Why are we still talking about it? Before the death of George Floyd, before the death of Tamir Rice, and the death of so many other young Black men and women, where we had cell phone footage. Before that, we had footage, right? This is an ongoing issue. And so if I use the example of the volcano or earthquakes, right? It's inevitable that this will happen again because we never address the deeper underlying root issues and the causes. We only looked at the superficial surface level. And what you saw, and media portrays it this way, Koreans are taking advantage of communities. Blacks don't like Koreans, Koreans don't like Blacks. Part of that may be true, right? But that's not the whole picture. And what media never covers is white supremacy really drove this, really pitted one community against the other. So I'll stop there. I have more to say, of course, but reframing this, I think, is important to say. It's the underground level that really bubbles up every few years.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. And I think that will lead well into what Leon has to share, especially because he was able to cross the line north as he worked in Glendale at the time, I believe. And so, Leon, do you want to share some of your perspectives?
Yeah,
what were the riots? What do people need to know about it?
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. Excuse me. I have a little different perspective. So, as Raymond said, so it's about 92. I'm working as a field technician. I'm literally living in South Central. So I remember the Latasha Harlin incident because that was on, I think it was 91st and Figueroa or something like that. And I lived on 82nd and Vermont, in between Normandy and Vermont. So I was about maybe 15 minutes walk from Normandy and Florence, where everything kind of popped off. So I'm living there, but the same token, I'm also in this kind of liminal space because I'm working in Glendale. I'm a field technician, so I'm traveling all over the place. I have a lot of white colleagues, white customers. So I remember when the verdict was being announced. I remember at church, I remember my neighborhood, we're all like, well, you know what? We're upset about Rodney King. We're upset about what happened, but justice is about to happen. Because, I grew up in a conservative church. So we're thinking, this is it. justice is going to take place. We're going to show law and order. And of course, it didn't happen. And the LaTocha Harlings incident, and with the failed justice, for us, it was a sense of, I remember the detention was, this justice is not happening. We still are in the same place we were back in Martin Luther King. And I remember being watching television. It was surreal because we saw the what was happening at Florence and Normandy. It was literally, 15 minutes from our house. And so we kind of will walk outside, see some flames, go back inside, watch the TV. We're not sure how things are going to happen. But here's the thing that was unique for me. We were obviously already in tension because of what happened to LaTocha. We were upset about the situations with Rodney King. I would go to work. I would go to Glendale. Life was completely different. No one was concerned. It was almost the way I described it to my friends when I went back home. I said, it's amazing. I see smoke. I see there's no police presence. Where everybody in the neighborhood is tense. I go to Glendale. Because remember, I was a field tech, so I'm driving to Beverly Hills. I'm driving to other places that was protected. It was as if birds were singing, rainbows were everywhere, and in my area, there was smoke and sometimes you would see I don't want to say a tank, but you would see the what do you call it? National Guard. So you would see this. I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's a war zone here, but over here it's paradise. And here's the thing: what reflecting on it now, there was tension between African American community and the Asian community. But here's the thing that listening to everyone talk that made me reflect on conversations I had back then. I would get this, and this is crazy. Wow, Leon, why are the blacks tearing up everything? Why are they tearing up their own community? They should stop. Don't you think they should stop? So, I'm in a predominantly white space, so I learned how to code switch early. So they would say those things, but here's the flip side. Wow, Leon, isn't it interesting? Man, those Asians don't like black people. Wow, it's a shame what they did. So again, I'm getting this conversation from the same basically white community telling me, putting both communities against each other. And that was the narrative that I was hearing. So I'm in this liminal space thinking, how do I process this? But, as a young man that's trying to work, I didn't have all the tools that I needed at the time to process all this. But I think for me, the reason is still significant because it has still set the dialogue, or I shouldn't say set the dialogue, it still has prevented the dialogue between our two communities. It's still, that dialogue has still hasn't happened. When I was in South Central, don't be upset with me. I'm just telling you where it was when I was there. I didn't know Asians were Christians. Because we didn't attend church. We didn't fellowship with any Asians, at least for the church I was at. So I just assumed Asians were 100% Buddhist or not religious at all, because that's the way it was presented, from. So that, I think, is the real tragedy, is that even our Christian churches where we could have come together and done some good and really had some dialogue going, that was not taking place for me in South Central. And later on, but I will tell you the bright spots, some of the relationships I did have with some of the agents in the community that changed my life to this day. So it's not all gloom and doom. I think there is some room for that was definitely a bright spot for me and definitely has changed my life. That it was a direct result of two things: direct result of the riots, but also a direct result of some relationships I had formed in South Central with some of my Asian brothers at the time.
All this is so good. I mean, my mind is going in 1,000 different directions because I'm like, I want to press into this, I want to press into that. How do we capture as much? But and unfortunately, there's so many ways in which we can examine this. There's one. So this is kind of going off of script a little bit, but Hyepin, you said something that was really kind of powerful. There was more to the story than the way the Korean community was depicted. And I think there's more to the story than the way that the African American community was also depicted. I think it'd be great to kind of press into that, especially because, Mark, you talked about how, Rodney King was basically stereotyped. And because he was stereotyped, he was viewed as a threat. And because he was viewed as a threat, he was easily brutalized. And, and we just see the same patterns emerging over and over and over again. He was a kind of an archetype for what a lot of African American men experienced. With Alex, what you said about this being a volcano, and the events taking place with Latasha Harlins being killed and Soon Ja-doo, there's nuance and complexities to that, but it was, she shouldn't have gotten killed, and the tension should have been addressed before. There should have been ways of bringing the communities together, and a lot of that actually does emerge in the challenges that we face, because our communities are oftentimes in echo chambers. That the anti-Black sentiments emerged as a result of white supremacy, but get reinforced because we're not in communities that are seeking understanding about other communities, especially the Black community. And then the same thing with anti-Asian sentiments. And I think several of us work across the color line and build bridges, and in the process of building bridges, we hear the pervasive things that are being said about each other's communities. And I know that in the work that I'm doing, I'm working in the Asian communities, trying to extract and expunge and dismantle any anti-Blackness. And then when I connect with my African American brothers and sisters, we're talking about the pervasive stereotypes and the views that are very pervasive within the African American community about the Asian American community, and trying to say, okay, there's an element in which we have to educate our own communities, but we have to model a way forward. And so even when last year, shortly after the Atlanta shootings, we hosted a Black and Asian panel here in Chicago with at Bishop Horace Smith's church with Charlie Dates and Otis Moss and several other African American leaders, and then several Asian American leaders. And one of the things that I found really profound was when Charlie said, in 1992, the difference between today and 1992 was when in 1992, there weren't that many calls that he and other African Americans received after Rodney King was brutalized. And we organized a march here in Chicago that basically, as all the African American leaders, as I was marching with the churches here, kept asking me, "Where are the Asian Americans? Where are the Asian Christians?" I said, "I'll show you." And so we organized a march here that had about 1,000 to 2,000 people show up, and we marched from a historic Asian church to a historic Black church. And for a lot of African Americans, they shared that was the first time that any community they saw organizing specifically for them, and that really helped build a lot of bridges into the African American community here. But I think it's really helpful to kind of press into how is it that the Korean community, or the Asian American community more broadly, is depicted, and what is it that people need to know, and then how is it that the African American community is depicted, and what do people need to know? And I'll leave it to any of you to kind of chime in.
Can I like to say, for me, one thing that I really have been disappointed up to this point in my life is the lack of knowledge. And because I just discovered, I'm talking maybe within the past 7 years, which I'm a little embarrassed, I had no idea of the economic shape of South Central at the time was sort of orchestrated by our government, orchestrated by the politicians. So in other words, Blacks weren't allowed to get certain loans. We weren't allowed to open businesses, but then Koreans or other Asians, they were limited to where they can even get loans and businesses. So they sort of created this economic disparity, but No one ever told us. So we literally thought, and which was so wrong, we literally thought, here comes, and it was primarily Koreans, but here comes the Koreans coming into our neighborhoods, taking our goods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this resentment, but we had no idea that this was being orchestrated. And here's the sad part. I have 3 degrees, a PhD. I was educated in Reseda, California. I was also had the opportunity to have degrees from different colleges before I landed at Biola. So I have all these, and no one ever mentioned this. This is new information to me. That information, I think, would have helped both of our communities. What really helped me, that changed my life, in my view of the Asian community was 2 gentlemen in South Central at the time. One was my cleaners, and it wasn't my cleaners, it was my mother's cleaners. My mother used to go there. And then when my mother got older and she needed my help when she got sick, I started going to the cleaners. And I started using it myself. So he knew my mother, he knew me. He would ask questions, how is your mom doing? And we had dialogue. I think the son may have taken over, but we still talked. And the other one I remember was my auto mechanic. It was Chung. I still remember the name of the place, Chung's Auto Mechanic. Again, my mother went there. I went there. We had relationships. He would ask me about your mother. He would ask me about how you doing, how's your job, and he knew where I worked and blah blah. The point is, the riots, as bad as it was, as impactful as it was, it hit me hard, and it became extremely personal when I remember driving down Manchester and my cleaners was burnt down, and this was a Korean business. And that's when it hit me hard. I was like, wait, this is real. So, but it wasn't because it was a Korean store, it's because I had a relationship with him. But I think that relationship was few and far between in our communities. So if there's one thing I would definitely want to say is we have to re-educate ourselves or educate ourselves and get these dialogues going to understand what the real issue was at the time, what was really causing the division. And I've learned since then that we have way more in common than we have difference. And because like I've shared with you earlier, my wonderful life group that I have, where a majority are Asian, I'm learning through them and through students that there's so much in common. There's so much struggle that we have in common that should unite us. Can unite us. You let me stop talking because I get kind of passionate on this stuff.
Well, I so very much appreciate, Leon, your sharing. And for me, I've shared this in other forums, but, first of all, during the LA riots, I saw our community kicked down and crying alone, and the question of why weren't there others there to cry with us, right? And I also carried this burden of, could there be a better way for our community? And I had the opportunity to see a model at First AME Church where they partnered with the broader community, and they were able to tap and leverage resources and increase their kingdom impact. But in addition, I saw these stakeholders now having a stake in the church's success, and they were lauding the work of the church in rooms and places where usually God, church, or communities of color are rarely mentioned. And so that has really taken me on this path where I said, I want to, and where God gets honor too, right? So I said, gosh, I want to bring this to my community. Long story short, God led me to be able to work at First AME, but also start our organization, Faith and Community Empowerment. And we've had over 800 partners plus, from White House to Fortune 500. And some of my strongest mentors, right, have come from leaders from the Black community, including Mark here in the room. And yet, and also, Mark had toasted even at my wedding, right? So it's that kind of friendship, relationship, respect, and appreciation. But I knew that whenever we came to the conversation of the Korean store owner / Black customer, that would shift. And I would see, someone like Mark, a good person, good heart, and who normally respond with empathy if you had heard of someone's devastation. Instead of responding with empathy, I would see this hardness and also comments that really was hurtful and painful. And, I really sought understanding because I cared about these leaders and I desired to continue to be in fellowship with them. But that dissonance that I felt was kind of like someone who was dating someone that your parents didn't approve, and you're stuck in the middle and wanting both to see each other and to appreciate each other, but obviously they were not seeing eye to eye. And so I, again, really sought understanding and wisdom, and along the way, I came to see and realize that there were certain narratives that were being told about these Korean store owners that really put them into the category of evil, and breeds resentment, right? And so, again, there is this sense that they're exploiting and profiteering. And I just want to share that a typical $150,000 liquor convenience neighborhood store, my husband was a business broker. He said that after expense, but before payroll, they only net $2,000 to $3,000. Now, even for one person, that's pitiful nothing. But you're supposed to divide that over 4 workers because they have long shifts, right? 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. Typically, you need a cashier and someone in, stocking, right? So you need 2 people, 2 shifts. And $2,000 to $3,000 is going to be like pitiful nothing. And it's also a very dangerous job. It is the second highest of being killed on a job. Number 1 is taxi driver, and then number 2 is a convenience store employee. So really, and also that we get special loans, right? And I want to say there is no special loan. If there is, let me know, because the work that I do as an organization is by sharing resources to the community, right? It's just really just a lot of hard hours and sacrifice and using family labor and people working 2 shifts to make it sustainable. And really, it's not sustainable. And as mentioned that, when you are dirt poor and you're trying to buy a business, you're not going to be able to buy it in Beverly Hills or Century City or such, right? It's going to be in a lot of neighborhoods where probably there's low income, and as a result, probably, most likely high crime. And so they end up not there by choice or targeting, but just by default. And for the Korean community, we have such a high education rate, but in 2000, we were one of 4 communities whose income was below the national median, with Latino, Black, Native American as well, right? And everyone's going to be surprised, but Korean and Black homeownership rate is the same, even now. And so we're kind of stuck in the same boat, the same economic wheelchair. And, I was in a room through the generosity of Reverend Jim Wallace with a bunch of, white evangelical leaders, right? And I had the privilege, this is right after the Atlanta massacre, Raymond and myself and Russell Jung was invited to present. And I shared some of the data points I shared, but really there was a lot more, whether it's criminal justice system, whether it's mental health, whether it's COVID-19. I just kind of went on breaking that model minority myth that really, again, says that the Asian community is white adjacent and that we're privileged and that we're not victims of racism. But as I said, the racist system doesn't discriminate who they discriminate against, right? It's everyone who doesn't have power. And so I was able to share that. And Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, who was in the same room, who's now become such a an ally, such an advocate, and truly a friend and mentor. She said that when she started hearing me present initially, she said that she started, oh gosh, there's a word that she used, but basically she was very upset. But it was a very colorful word. I can't remember now. A pissy fit. That's what she said. She was having a pissy fit because she felt that really I was detracting time away from issues and addressing the Black community's challenges. And that these white people had not paid enough attention to it, and here I am stealing that time. But as she started to pay attention, she said that her better self showed up. And as she came to listen, she realized that really the challenges impacting Black community, the same challenges were impacting the Asian community, and that justice for the Black community cannot happen without also justice happening for the Asian community. And, I am so, so grateful that, I feel like my mother, Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner is seeing my boyfriend, right? And going, hey, or I'm sure, Mark will be able to share as well. But, he's, again, someone that I, again, appreciate, respect, and wanted and desired to continue a relationship. But this was that one space that I held so close to my heart, because I didn't feel safe to share and be confident that our relationship would go to end up at a better place. And without that safety, I was fearful. And the Atlanta massacre happened, and Mark gave me a call to say, how can I help? Gave me some good advice. And it led to this very powerful conversation with 4 Black clergy and 4 Asian clergy. And it was just so powerful. And Mark wrote this op-ed. He volunteered and he titled it Asian Lives Matter. And for me, there was this moment of, I don't know the word glee, glee in the sense of finally feeling like, I'm being heard, I'm being seen, and Mark gets it. But then, again, my better self also showed up. I thought, Mark is going to get himself into trouble. And so I called Mark and said, are you sure you want to use this title? And he said, absolutely. And he moved forward, and he didn't stay in some private room. He shouted on the tops of the mountain. He called the LA Sentinel to publish it. He also got it on the front page of the Christian Recorder, the newsletter for AME that goes to every newsletter of AME pastors across the country. I'm sorry, the front page to every, I'm sorry, I'm getting too excited here. But every AME pastor, not just in the country, but in the world. And I am so grateful for this friendship and this partnership and the door that God has opened. And like I said, I feel like, hey, now my boyfriend and my parents could all get along, be in the same room. And I hope that same type of outcome can happen for all of us in all our rooms as well.
Alex, I don't want to step on your toe. I won't be long. I think we all suffer from implicit bias, and then we also suffer from confirmation bias. And we are looking for things to confirm our bias, our implicit bias. And I think I can give 2 examples. When Ted Koppel was at First AME Church, he opens up his program saying to 2 gang members, why won't the church let you inside? And they go on to say, churches don't really care, blah, 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 blah. And then he comes in to the church and he interviews Cecil Murray and me and a whole bunch of others. Some of us may remember that. And Cecil Murray begins to correct him on international television because he was confirming a bias he thought even Black people had against gang members. I was an ex-gang member. I think the same is true about this thought about African Americans and Asians, because most African Americans look at Asians as the model Americans. So we don't we don't see it. I know, and I was talking to Kenny Omer and a couple of people. We said we don't even think about Asians. When Hyepin and I started working together, I didn't see any bias. I saw a brilliant woman that I wanted to work at First AME Church. Brilliant. I mean, whoever gets her going to be blessed. Amen. And so it wasn't about hiring an Asian woman. It was about hiring a brilliant person to work at First AME Church. But I think the same confirmation bias took place with the Sunjadu, Latasha Harlan's case, where the community broad brushed it and said all blacks hate Asians and Asians must have some thought. I live in South Central. I lived on 43rd and Crenshaw, amen, and never thought about it. Never thought about Asians. I come from St. Louis. We didn't even think Asians existed in St. Louis because it's only black and white. You know, so when the unrest did take place, I think a lot of African Americans tied it to 1965, 1964 riot and the mistreatment of black men in general. I've been pulled over so many times just because I was black that it's crazy. And I remember the first time I was 22. No, that's 22. I was 26 in Los Angeles. I can talk about younger in St. Louis, but when I was 26 in Los Angeles, the police officer put me up against the wall, slammed his hand up against between my legs, hurting my scrotum, and said, "You must have a weapon there." And he popped me real good, and he looked at me and laughed and got back in his car. So driving while black is a reality in Los Angeles. So for me, the unrest had much more to do with this police, the unbridled power of the police department and the arrogance. And we have statistics that prove that many cases that the police were hired from the South and they had racist ties to the KKK and others, where they treated us as if we were common slaves and criminals. No matter, I like what you said, Brother Leon. I do understand the degrees, but the degree of the complexion of your skin had more to do with how you were treated in South LA than how many things you had inside your head. And so my challenge has been and has always been, and that's why I tied into Hyepin. I felt a sense of loyalty to the Korean community through Hyepin because I knew her. We worked together. We managed some real good programs together. But when Hyepin opened up to me, and I'm sorry it took so long for me to have created either some way a barrier that may have prevented her, but when she opened up to me and shared with me the challenges that the Korean community faces, and I'm sorry, I tend to see Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, right? And so, and I've always known that the Koreans are kind of like the Negroes of the Orient. And so, in my opinion, when she started sharing, I started weeping because I said, boy, I have the same implicit bias that the white folk had on me. And at that point, I said, okay, we're going to do something about this. And believe it or not, I didn't get any resistance from my black brothers and sisters. None. We need to do something about it. I think the challenge is what Leon said. We have more in common than contrast, and we don't talk enough about it, but we buy into this media hype that's designed to sell news time to make money for rich people who don't need any more money. And so whatever they can do to pit one another against one another to make money for themselves and their sponsors, that we will do. I will never forget watching Rodney King get his butt beat every day on television. I mean, every day we saw that thing. And so, and the same is true with the pictures of my Korean brothers on top of rooftops with guns. You know, nobody ever talks about the white people who had long guns shooting black people. But the point is that they assume that the guns were pointed at just black people. I don't agree with that, because when I looked at the pictures they had on the front page of the LA Times on April the 30th, the unrest, and they showed black people rioting, But in the picture, there were white people stealing money from the May Company on Wilshire Boulevard. The picture showed white people stealing money, breaking into the store, but the picture showed white people, but the headline said black people rioting again. I said, wait a minute, can't you see? No, it's a confirmation bias. And unfortunately, we buy into this white supremacy stereotypical headline that has us all kind of twisted.
Beautiful. Yeah. I got very little to follow. Thank you for that, Mark. I'll add one piece in terms of what we have in common in all our communities. Everyone's hurting. To recognize the immigrant experience, culture stress, immigration stress, language barriers that build on the challenges of being low income, on top of very, very difficult work environments that Hyepin has already alluded to. That weighs heavy. Smiles usually don't come off your face when you're in that kind of context. You didn't choose to work in a swap meet or work in a dry cleaner or work in a convenience store in a country that's not your own, right? That's heavy. It's not a comparison of who suffers more, but to recognize that everyone's hurting. And I think that's the part that gets missed in our conversations, because everyone's quick to say, oh, that happened to you. Well, here's what happened to me. But it's not in a desire to hear each other. It's more, hey, I'm going to one-up you and tell you how my pain is worse. And I think this is the part for Christians, especially, to recognize there is a third way. And this is where Christian communities can come together and talk with one another and say, let me lead from a perspective of repentance and say where I've missed it. And then also to be able to say, to lead from a perspective of empathy, to say, please tell me your story, because I want to hear your pain. And I think that's the piece that I see coming together increasingly. It took more than 30 years, but it's encouraging. This very conversation is a good reminder of that.
And I do think, go ahead, Hyepin. Go ahead.
I guess part of the reason why I'm on this campaign to tell the truth, lift up the truth, right, is because in some ways I feel that the last 30 years, any attempts, are still better than nothing in terms of solidarity. But I think at the same time, when there is a misdiagnosis, then the solution for that problem is not helpful. And so I liken it to yelling at someone to jump and they refuse. But if you realize that they are in a wheelchair, that is a very critical piece of the truth that you need to know in your goal and desire for them to jump. And I really feel like with the store owner / again, Black customer relationship, that if the reality of these store owners, that they are in an economic wheelchair, that we could come up then with better discussions and better solutions. As an example, I think of one common request is that they should hire locally. And I told you that they're working 2 shifts, working 7 days, 16-hour days, and using free family labor, right? Netting $2,000 to $3,000, which that's supposed to cover 4 people. So they're in a wheelchair. They can't jump. However, why not put a on-the-job training program there? It's a win for the store owner, right? Because they get extra help, maybe even an ambassador, because that individual will now see the challenges that the store owner deals with. It's a win for the employee. They get paid, they get job skills, maybe even business skills to set up business in the future. It's a win for the community because, you know what, they get better service, and there's someone who was unemployed but now a productive contributing member of society. I think that solution would not be possible. It wouldn't have come without, again, that proper assessment of that situation. And so I think that, again, whenever we are holding myths that demonize others, we should take a step back, right, to expose the truth, to assess the situation more comprehensively, not to do blaming, to say, but what do they need? You know, Leon, I appreciate your sharing about your relationship with the dry cleaner and also with the mechanic. I think that for these individuals, they live, even though it's a hard job, they don't face the same kind of reality as working in the dangers of a convenience store employee, right? And so, you know, again, at the end of the day, we're all human, responding in a human way to human conditions. And whether it's the Black community and all the challenges that have been superimposed in this, history of systemic racism, to Asians and Korean store owners who, again, have also faced the same racist system, but maybe impacting us in a different way, that we're all there, again, human response to human conditions, and to raise the question, what do they need? Why are they responding this way? What are the challenges that are being imposed? And as Christians, then, to seek wisdom of how can we come with, coming alongside to stand in solidarity for one another. And one last comment, because I knew Mark and I done some studies, I took a Black English literature class when I was in college, and, knew a lot, that I thought I knew the challenges of the African American community as an outsider. But when I saw the movie, I think it was something justice. It was
poetic justice.
No, it wasn't poetic justice. Anyway, I can't remember. But basically, there's a scene where this lawyer who graduated from a prominent like Harvard Law School, instead of getting a corporate big paycheck job, decides to work for, I think, something like NAACC.
Just Mercy.
Yes.
Yeah, Just Mercy.
Just Mercy. And there is a scene where at nighttime he's driving towards some destination, and then there's a flashlight of the police car, right? And for the first time, I felt the fear that I believe that was driving while Black, and I feared for his life. And it was something really real. It was eye-opening for me. And I think, again, for all of us, we should all have those moments, right, with one another. And I'm being told over and over again that we don't have a relationship with one another. I think people like Mark, me, Alex, Leon, Raymond, like we're rare birds. And we need to do more so that we could have those conversations and those relationships.
I think I don't disagree with you. I think there's a challenge in public policy. For instance, you mentioned I think it was Leon that mentioned the challenge of not being able to get home loans and business loans in South LA. Well, I did work with an organization called Greenlining, and Greenlining did deal with public policy and how we changed that type of policy within corporate America, and we exposed it. And we made banks and investment companies invest in South LA. I think the other challenge, of course, is the truth is confectionery or those little corner stores. I worked at a 7-Eleven in South LA once. I will never do it again. It's a dangerous job. It's a dangerous job. Let me be clear with you. Whether you Black, white, Asian, or Latino, it don't matter. It don't matter. If you're going to be in South LA where there's cash, they're going to come after your. Yeah. So my point is like, I think you can do the kumbaya with the Asians. The Asians can hire somebody. It just means that whoever they hire, they're going to get their butt beat too. So I think we really need to take a look at the real challenges of poverty in communities that are suffering economically. And if we don't do that, and if we don't do it from a public policy position as well as a private policy position, then we will continue to have the Sunjadu, Latasha Harlins. They may be Latino and Black because that don't make the news. they may be black and black. That don't make the news. But what did make the news is Latasha Harlins and Soon Jadu. That's the challenge for me. I think it's a public policy issue as well as dealing with private institutions and their inability to see the gold in their heels unless there's gentrification that's taking place like it is in Inglewood, California. And now everybody wants to live in Inglewood because of the stadium and all the money that's coming into that place.
You know, I want to say something real quick. I think earlier I may have misspoke and wasn't quite precise in my language. And when I made the statement of Korean shop owners received loans, I hope I didn't come across as if they received special loans or something that no one else got. I really meant was the way the system was orchestrated. They were under the same discriminatory practices as everyone else. Oh, well, not everyone else that wasn't white. So they were under those same discriminatory practices, which limited their economic mobility as well. And so as in South Central, we had no clue. We did not know that was the case for Koreans as well. We did not know that was the case for Chinese. That we did not know. We bought into the myth of the model minority because that's the way it was presented. And so I remember somewhere in my PhD program when I finally read the book about the myth of the model minority. I didn't read the whole thing because it wasn't assigned, but I read enough. I was like, wait, what? So, I was literally shocked at this, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. They are in almost the exact same boat that we're in. And when I say it was almost the exact same boat, we're just in two different boats. So I did not know that was the case. So I'm coming from a perspective now of higher education. That we're all as our educators. So I'm constantly thinking of we need to be educated because as coming from South Central, talking to and what Hyepin just mentioned, we didn't know that they weren't making that much money. As far as we're concerned, you have a business, you're making millions. You're rich, you're wealthy, you're affluent. We had no idea that they were struggling, that everyone was struggling as a business owner. So even that perspective would change how we view others. So I think for me, part of it is that constant education. And but at the same token, now I'm going to now move back to the area that I'm more comfortable in because I'm not a sociologist. I'm going to move back into the area I'm comfortable in, and that's back to the church. For me growing up, growing up in LA, because my church was on Figueroa and 67th. That's where my church was. Then we ended up on Slauson near Overhill, and a lot of sister churches in between. It still would have been wonderful if we had regular fellowship with our Asian churches. I didn't. That entire time I was there, we never shared one service, not even an Easter sunrise service with Asian church. But if we had that fellowship, if we had that, I think it would have really strengthened our communities more. And that's what I love what Raymond's doing in Chicago. And we definitely need more of that. We need more of that. Our churches coming together. And I think even that fellowship will bind us together. And then we can help work through some of these issues and get over this myth of the model minority that is pervasive. Because it broke my heart to see that with this resurgence since COVID of anti-Asian sentiment is breaking my heart to see that some of it was coming from Black folk. And it really did, like, wow, that is so unnecessary, because you do realize they're going through the similar struggle that we're going through. They're feeling some of the same discriminatory practices that we're feeling. But yeah, I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, this is a far better conversation than I was hoping for, and I was hoping for a lot. And so thank you for sharing. I kind of want to press in a little more. But I do want to say, like, even the way that, there's some challenges, right, with what we're even seeing now with the anti-Asian violence. I think the most prominent stories that are told, maybe apart from the Atlanta shooting, where the race is oftentimes not discussed of the perpetrator, who was homegrown in the church, unfortunately. The most prominent pictures and videos show up as African Americans, but if you look at the studies, the studies reveal that 75% of anti-Asian incidents, violence, hate attacks actually emerge from the white population. At the same time, there's a disproportionate, and Hyepin is the one that shared this with me, that there's a disproportionate level of violence attack between our communities, from the African American to the Asian. And so I don't remember what the stat was, Hyepin, that you shared. But in the public imagination, one of the things that we continue to find is if one Black person does one thing, that takes about 99% of all of the attention, making everyone, going back to what Mark Whitlock said, kind of confirm their biases, that Black people are dangerous, they're criminals, they're thugs. And anytime you hear these languages, they're code to basically keep us suspicious and at arm's length with African Americans. And we need to be guarding against that. We need to be addressing that, because I will tell you, the closer you get to the Black community, the safer you feel, because they come around you in ways that a lot of other communities likely will not. And there are times in which I wish the Asian American community was more like the Black community in that sense, where they, that they would rally and show solidarity. And that's a whole nother level of conversation. But I do want to say, I do want to ask the question about, what are some of the other things that you wish people would know about the events in 1992 that they might not know, that we haven't discussed? Because there's so much to unpack and there's so much to undo because of the things that were portrayed in the media, the stories that were told, the ways in which stereotypes were stretched out and basically spread out to the entire country and the world. Are there any other things before we kind of move into a kind of Christian response? And if there's nothing, that's okay.
I'll say real quick, and it won't take that long. We were, at least I remember my wife and I, we were at home in a state of uncertainty, but we were also afraid too. We weren't, all of us weren't in the streets ready to burn things down. We were nervous. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know who was going to be turned on to next, and we didn't know how things were. You know how riots go. Once that group mindset takes over, you can become a victim. So we weren't at home just secure in our Blackness and we're ready to burn everything down. We were definitely feeling let down. We felt neglected. We felt the Los Angeles no longer cared about us, because when Daryl Gates created that perimeter around the city and basically let us fend for ourselves, we felt, wow, you really don't care about us. And like I said, with me being a field technician, I had my car is stuck in the shop. But make a long story short, as I was driving around and saw where Beverly Hills was okay, Manhattan Beach was fine, Century City was fine, Glendale, Pasadena, those areas were fine. It just really let us know, wow, we are still back to W. Du Bois, right? We're still a problem, that you still see us as a problem. Unfortunately, what it didn't do, what it should have done, was allowed us to realize, like Hyepin said earlier, that perimeter included Koreatown. They were kept on the inside as well. So it should have woken up and said, wait a second, what communities are not protected? Koreatown, East LA, South LA, interesting. That really should have, but unfortunately that didn't happen. I'm sure there's a lot of sociologists going to have to tell us why that didn't happen. But so yeah, that's the one thing I think other people should know. We were still at home afraid. We're still a sense of uncertainty. We still had anxiety and angst. And because the police weren't protecting us, so now we felt extremely vulnerable. So I remember that particularly.
I think, go ahead, Alex.
reframing this is very important for us, and having a deeper perspective. The greatest violence that occurred on April of 1992 was a dominant white community, the dominant white mindset enacted against people of color. It was the police cordoning off an area and letting everyone burn. Right? It wasn't Black against Koreans. It wasn't Latino, take opportunistic Latino coming into a community. It was a white structure, folks in power who said, let's shut it down. Let them all deal with their own selves. We're going to close the doors. Where I say some things that are unpopular occasionally, but not just in terms of whiteness, but even for Asian Americans, this is a challenge where I say, can you see it now? Asian Americans maybe didn't have the same history, broadly speaking, with police officers. Light skin privilege would say things like, yeah, protect and serve. That's right. They're here for us. When you see police officers, you feel safe. That's true for a lot of light skinned folk, Asian Americans included. And then the riots, and this is my own testimony, it revealed that I wasn't important and my community was not important. That you let me down. And that was probably the biggest takeaway for me, was the very systems in place that they said they were here to protect and serve was not intended for me. And I found a new level of solidarity with my Black brothers and sisters. I'm like, oh, this is what you were talking about. So a little known fact, what did I do after the 92 riots? My response was I left social work. And I applied for the LAPD. And you can imagine how this interview went. As I passed the physical part and then the written, and then I had the interview, and I'm sitting there and they're like, so why do you want to be LAPD? Like, well, a year ago, I realized the LAPD let Koreatown burn, and I didn't see enough police officers who were Korean speaking or Asian American, and I never want to see this again. I never want to see a police leaving a community, and I want it to be community based. And I said something else about internal affairs, and they said, well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Goodbye. You may be surprised. I didn't get the job. I was not recruited as an LAPD officer. But anyway,
and you got to look at Alex is a buff guy. I mean, I would want him on my team. I would want him on my team.
The best physical shape of my life in preparation for all the physical exams and going to police academy and all that. But anyway, it's twisted because what I'd learned was they said, yeah, everything was fine. You scored, what was it, 80? And that was a good score. I was like, oh, that's good. Not good for Koreans, but 80 is a good score. And they said you needed to score 90 or above. I don't get the numbers exactly, but if you're Black or Latino, you can score 70. But if you're white and Asian, you needed to score higher. They said this to me. I wish I kept the paper. I said, wow, this is twisted. So it's complexifying in my own mind just how white supremacy really works. And so this led me into what I'm doing now as a faculty member at a Christian institution, trying to bridge the gap of what we're learning and we can educate, and also the role of the church and what Christians can do. So that's where I am.
Well, for me, I recently read somewhere that, people who watch Fox TV, if they are exposed to CNN for like so many hours, that they kind of shift. And so I think that shows kind of the power of media and the spaces that we choose to listen to. And so during the riots, actually, like I said, I was a USC MBA student. There'd be a lot of group community projects. I come home and my parents would have Korean TV on, and every night it felt like the recent period of the anti-Asian violence. But during that time, it was some Korean store owner being killed while running a store from their customer. So that was the reality that we had been exposed to, that I believe probably no one else really ever heard. And I believe around that season 91 to 93, I believe there was like 17, 19 store owners that were killed. And even around Latasha Harlins and Sunja Do, is truly just tragic. And I think, again, I mentioned about the trauma of being in that environment. And Mark, you mentioned about any color, working at a convenience store. And for Sunja Do, I think it is important, not so much because of Latasha Harlan Sunja Do, because that's in some ways it's done and happened, but of how we're going to address going forward, right? They've experienced shoplifting 40 times a week, every week, right? And their family, their store had been burglarized over 30 times, and also threats of their store being burned down 20 times, and their son's life was being threatened by gang members because he was going to be a witness against one of the gang members for robbing their store. And so I want to put that out there, and I have to confess that because the story of the 19 store owners and that sense that every day the Korean community was being attacked, as well as, again, that piece of Sunja Do, though, I learned 30 years after the fact. So even for me, I don't know the whole story as a Korean American. But so I have to confess that whole Latasha Harlan Sunja Do, in many ways, it also colored my perception. But, when I also removed the color, and I thought about a family member, whether they were good or bad, walking into a store, and regardless again what they did, that they would end up being shot and killed. It kind of gave me this kind of that unbelievable shock, and how horrible that must be and would have been if I was there. And so I just want to challenge everyone that, yes, I think it is important to see color. I mean, really it is, right? Because color of justice, like I said, it doesn't apply equally to everyone. And the police that we thought was there to serve and protect didn't apply to Koreans either. And that kind of rude awakening of the people who have power versus people who don't have power. But at the same time, I think it is equally helpful, particularly, especially as a Christian, right, to also then go through that scenario, removing color, right, and being able to see that situation as well. And so I want to put that out there. And I am thankful for social media for various reasons. I learned so much, first of all, about African American history and the challenges that they have encountered in this through social media. There's a lot of rooms that I learned, and about other communities. But the second piece is that, again, Asians are human just like everyone else, right? And I keep mentioning about responding to human conditions in a human way. And so in the past, when there have been protests and social justice issues, Asians have shown up. Not all of us, but then that's true for every community. There's going to be the people who are hardcore, and then there's the rest that, here or there. But there have been us. But a lot of times we get cut out of the photo. We get cut out of the photo, out of the picture. And again, our voices, our tools have been very limited. I've been in those corporate rooms where the CEO lays out how much they give to everyone. The Asian community share is the smallest, and pretty much under the AAPI umbrella, 20 countries, 50 groups, 100 languages. We're all very different people, and we're getting this little tiny bit, right? But anyway, regardless, I feel so grateful that social media has allowed us to see each other in action and to also show the world that we also care about others. And I think the George Floyd movement was so powerful. It was such a global and just, again, an amazing moment in time. And the Asian community was able to show up. And in the subsequent period, when the Atlanta massacre happened, I saw so many Black leaders show up for the Asian community, for which I am truly grateful.
Mark, is there anything you want to share?
I really don't have a lot to add other than this is a great conversation.
Affirmation is always good. Okay, so I'm going to round us out. Reflecting on your experiences, reflecting on your responses. If there are things that you haven't shared in the ways that you responded to 92 in 1992 and 93, it'd be great to share. But also, what do you wish that people can learn from your experiences? And then how do you want the church today, especially those in Black and Asian communities, to respond? And then
so I'm unapologetically Black, come out of Black seminary, really am about liberation theology. Biola, once they found that out, they didn't feel comfortable with me at all. At all. Let me be very clear. And James Cone, Gay Rod Wilmore. Yeah, that's just who I am. I know, look at him. He's feeling a little uncomfortable right now.
And we know
my point is,
that's Biola's problem. But, okay, yes.
I know. That's the issue. that's the issue. We want to deal with white supremacy. That's where the grounding is. My point is that I had to deal with my own challenges, and I had to grow. Because if I'm so myopic that I don't see the beloved community, then how am I different from a white evangelical that would support a president that holds a Bible upside down and talks about Chinese flu? I mean, I believe that's the impetus behind the Atlantic shooting, is that white people who are now the minority have become so empowered by this white supremacist that we had in the White House for 4 years, that they feel that they can say what they want, when they want, how they want. And having pastored in Orange County for 21 years, but in no problem, but when Trump got in office, literally, I am now being assaulted while I'm driving. I'm being stared at in this county of called Orange County, California, Irvine City. So I had to deal with my own. I remember when it took me 19 years to invite Hyepin to come and preach at my church. It took me 18 years to invite a white person to come and preach at my church, yet I'm talking about the beloved community. And so I had to deal with myself. Because I think it begins with leadership. And while we are able to challenge others, we have to take a look at the Black church and see, is heaven fully integrated or is it just Black heaven? And I think once we come out of ourselves to the greater self of God, now we begin to create the beloved community, and the glory of God is realized, because I think many of us are on the road to Emmaus, and God is saying, God through Jesus Christ is saying, why are you walking in the wrong direction? And I think if we do fellowship, and I mean more than just fellowship at the dinner table, but to begin to look at theological underpinnings and realize that we've been dealing with this in the wrong manner for too long.
Powerful.
Reflecting back for me, I think what has happened is interesting the way Mark framed it, that I had to learn that from that experience, from what happened with my the not the grocery store, but the cleaners and the mechanic, the automobile, that relationship, and going to school with more and more Asians, many from many different countries. I learned through my theology, especially working through, as Raymond knows, I studied Colin Gunton. That's what I did my PhD on. So his pneumatological project really helped me to see the beauty in the particularity of each individual, but also each group that Jesus has brought into the kingdom. So learning that, what is done is I really take that Luke 4 passage serious, with Jesus, he come with good news to the oppressed. So I take that good news to the poor and liberation for the oppressed. I take that serious. So I really wish I was had the time back in the 90s to reflect, but I reflect on it now, where I no longer look at like what Hyepin said about the situations of the Koreans with how many of them were being attacked and killed, which of course we didn't know. That's not the way the narrative was for our television. But now I know to say each person I see, each individual I see, each community I see now, I want you to tell me, how has sin oppressed you? How has the nature of sin, especially the systemic sin, how has it oppressed you like it has oppressed us? Maybe it's been different, but it's still there. So now I'm asking those questions. So I want to now engage in your narrative, engage in your conversation, and engage in your experience so I can help understand how this systemic nature of sin has been impacting your community. So now I can be more understanding. And it's really helped a lot. But at the same token, the book Color of Law by Richard Rothstein? Yeah, I love what he says in the beginning. And I think this is where I'm just going to say it, our white evangelical brothers and sisters, what they don't realize is this is not hey, let's blame you. This is the way the situation is now. Let's all fix it. We all have to work together to fix it. But that's why I love that he said, but at the same token, what this means is I'm going to have to enter into your world the best of my ability, understand it. And so I think as a church, we have to realize everybody's the image bearer. We say that, right? We say that all the time. Well, these are image bearers. But do we really mean that? Do we really mean then I'm going to hear your story, I'm going to take it serious, and I'm going to at that point, assume it's real, it's true, and help be part of the solution, as opposed to blame the victim. So I hear that we're image bearers, but I'm going to figure out a way to blame you because I'm okay. Where no. So I think that's the thing. I would love our churches to take that pneumatological. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, there's liberty, but take that liberation serious. That different communities have been affected by the systemic problem of sin, the systemic level that has caused oppression, that has caused the Korean. I'm going back to Hyepin's original analogy, that has caused the Korean shop owners to behave or act in the way that they had to, but it also caused the Black community to behave and act in a certain way that we can now diagnose it, that, you know what, there's one thing that we both have in common. We've both been oppressed by the systemic level of sin differently. It's caused us to react differently. But now that we both can realize that the Spirit has allowed us to, what is my job as a Christian? I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to work as hard as I can to restore the dignity of every group. I'm going to work as hard as I can to restore that Christ-given dignity for them, which means I'm going to have to acknowledge that their dignity has been taken away. And so that's where I've been operating lately. And I wish our churches, especially our churches of color, would come together and go, you know what, we're going to work as hard as we can to allow the spirit of liberation to help me and make me unrest. I love what Motman says. Motman says, the Spirit liberated me, but now I am unrest. I am unease until my brothers and sisters are liberated. And so that's what I really wish our churches would come together and go, we're not happy until it's that line, excuse me, I'm going all over the place in genres here. But it's sort of that line from Hamilton, right? We're not all truly free until all are truly free. And so Yeah, sorry. I went from Rothstein to Hamilton to theology to Moltmann to German idealism. Sorry about that. This is what systematic theologians do. We all over the place.
It was good.
So forgive me.
It was good. It was good. Okay, I'll go. I think that first, just like we were deceived by Satan by his lies, we need to make sure that we don't believe those lies about one another. We should deal with and realize that there is a lot of diagnostic problems of one another, right? And then I would also say that we need to show up for one another. And I confess, as an Asian American, where our voices have been silenced and been told over the years that our voices don't matter, even when we speak up, it gets erased, and you just kind of get into that habit that your voice doesn't matter. But I have learned, especially during the Atlanta massacre, when other voices from other communities show up, pick up that phone and call, how valuable and powerful that is. And so I want to challenge our Asian American brothers and sisters. Let's also, own the voice that God has given us, to use it for good, right? To show up for one another, but also then to, again, know our own community's truths and realities, because again, it's not just the other communities that don't know about our community. Even our own Asian community don't know about our reality, because everyone tells us we're the model minority, right? And so again, to know the truth. And finally, I think, Mark addressed policy. We need to work together to address policy. Then we don't have to deal with the reality of being pitted against one another if we address the policy, right?
My reflection is, and my confession is, I'm still recovering. Our own racialized trauma of what happened 30 years ago. Anyone who's experienced any sort of trauma understands. You say, "Oh, I thought that was so long ago. Didn't you have that conversation before? You should be better now." That's usually not how it works. And so to continue to lean in, to have conversations, reflections, even after 30 years, I think it helps with my own trauma. So that's an important piece. The other reflection for me and the recovery, I loved, Mark, what you were saying, being unapologetically Black. And for me, I think I'm apologetically Asian. It's this, and Reverend Dr. Cornel West said, "Every day I'm trying to kill the white supremacist that lives in me." And if Dr. West could say something like that, then I could say something like that. I'm recovering from my own whiteness, right? And I want to start there. I'm recovering from my own anti-Blackness. Seeing the sin and seeing the root causes of sin that bear fruit in my own hatred of self, hatred toward others along racial lines, I think that's an important piece for all of us to consider. I want to end with a little bit of a hope, and the differences perhaps between 30 years ago and today. I was really sad 30 years ago thinking of the lack of representation of Asian Christian leaders. We had a handful of leaders who I said, well, I don't know if that's not really my community. I saw Angela O was great, not traditionally from the church. We had Bohwan Kim, who was my boss's boss at KYCC. He was on Nightline with Ted Koppel, and we're so excited, in this rare moment where I'm like, hey, I've never seen another Asian on television 30 years ago, ever so briefly, and then he wasn't on anymore. The hope that I have today is just the number of voices that I've seen, people who are courageous to speak up. Ray, you're one of them. Hyepin, you're one of them. To be able to speak, not just for our own issues, but Hyepin, as you said, speaking for others. And you see this deeper level of solidarity, that it's not just, hey, something happened in my community, so I've got to speak up for me and mine. You realize, hey, something's happening in other communities and we need to speak up. That's both individual Asian Christian leaders, as well as churches. And it's encouraging to see the increase of churches for the Asian American community in particular, um, to get more involved and to have a voice, and I see that trending, and it's really, really encouraging. And I hope if you're watching this, you're listening to this, and you ask, what do I do next, right? That would be next is not to be afraid. In some sense, we're silenced. We're invisible, partly because, and I'm speaking for myself, how much of that is my own doing? That I'm like, oh, I don't want to speak. I'm going to defer to someone else and all of this. And so to deal with that. So very hopeful.
Thank you all for those reflections. Beautiful and powerful. This was an incredible conversation. I want to just conclude by saying thank you to all of you, and I also want to share that I hope that this was an encouragement to everyone who tuned in. Thank you. If you're not following us on social media at Asian American Christian Collaborative, please do so at AACC or AA Christ Collab, and make sure you sign up for our newsletters because that's where you'll get the kind of the most current content. And then, of course, just continue to press in. Don't just make an Asian friend or a Black friend, but actually read the histories, attend their churches, connect with the communities and the work that are being done in the communities. Well, I just want to say thank you to each of you. This was such a powerful conversation and discussion. It's going to serve so many people well, and I hope that those who tuned in know that they can always come back to the recording and to hear more and to reflect more. There are so many gems shared, some profound and deep thought. We're so grateful that each of you shared, and so thank you so much for that. If you found this conversation helpful, if you found this discussion helpful, we do hope that you share it with others, help people see kind of what they need to see and to learn what they need to learn. And if you aren't following AACC's efforts and work as we seek to equip, empower, and educate Asian American Christians and friends of our communities on issues that are deeply pertinent to our faith, as well as our life in this world, in this broken and fallen world, I encourage you to follow us on social media at AA Christ Collab, Instagram and Twitter. And of course, if you are not on our mailing list, please do so by going onto our website, AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com, and then signing up for our mailing list, as you'll get all the newest information as we continue to do things that are there for your edification. We're also on Facebook, Asian American Christian Collaborative, and of course you can reach out to us if you ever have any questions or comments. We are also a volunteer-led organization, and so we are asking people to prayerfully consider supporting the work that we're doing at AACC as we produce materials, as we convene people and groups and leaders, and we share insights into Asian American Christianity that is for the church. And so please prayerfully consider supporting us through prayer, and as well as finances, which you can give on our website at aachristcollab.com. Thank you for those who are giving, and for those who are giving on a monthly basis, as those monthly gifts are the most helpful for the work that we're doing. And I pray that you would let us know what the impact of AACC has been for you. If there are things that you want to see, also reach out to us, because we'd love to hear from you and to do our best to serve your needs. If you're also interested in looking to volunteer, we're always looking for good people to connect with us and to work with us. And so thanks again for tuning in. Thank you again to my esteemed panelists. I'm so grateful that you are in my life and friends of our AACC community. Many blessings to you on this and every day moving forward.